Gaby.
Hey.
Hey, it's good to see you again.
I know.
Yeah, I'm excited for this talk. I was happy to write about your work for the gallery, for the exhibition, and we thought it would be lovely to expand different themes and notions that are inherent to your practice and this exhibition in particular. And so I think I'd like to start asking you about your coming of age as a young French and British queer artist of Palestinian origin, growing up in London in the 2000s. And particularly, perhaps, what were your main influences in art, music, or popular culture?
I think that's a really good question because I feel like everybody's got a bit of a story in a way. Everyone's background is super interesting. I was basically, my parents met in a hostel in South London, and then I was born there, and then they broke up. So my mum moved back to Rouen in northern France. And we lived there until I was 4, 5. I went to school there and stuff.
So you spoke French?
I spoke French before I spoke English.
Yeah.
And then we moved back to the UK because my mum had her issues with France. And then and basically started life there. My dad had gone back to Palestine. And then it wasn't until later on in life, in my early 20s and stuff, that I really, really connected with him basically. And then I ended up going to Palestine and meeting half brothers, half sisters, the other side of the family in the West Bank, Bethlehem area. So I'd say my upbringing's been, in a way, scattered a little bit across borders and countries and cultures. The culture in my house in the UK was always very mixed European and Arabic as well. It wasn't British to say, which was also super interesting, I don't know, to speak a different language in the house and another one in the school and stuff. And I think, I feel like when you're in between cultures, in between languages a bit, you're in a bit of a hybrid terrain. And I think art is a great vessel to speak to that. So I think that's how I came to looking at art, to engaging with culture, to meeting also other people who are essentially going through the same thing. South London is such a diverse area, so I definitely wasn't alone in that process, and a lot of my friends were from a similar background and stuff. So yeah.
And were there any cultural figures that inspired you at different stage of your life or work?
When I was super young, because my practice is mostly centered around painting, I was just really into the Impressionists, like Van Gogh, Monet, all the cliche ones that you discover when you're a teenager, when you're in your early 20s and stuff. Also, my first understanding of contemporary art was joining a lot of gallery youth groups, in the UK, the Tate, the Whitechapel Gallery. These institutions have kind of youth groups where 15 to 25-year-olds meet up, and you often learn about contemporary art, respond to contemporary art. And that was my first engagement with learning what a curator was, learning what an institution was, learning what an institutional space was, and seeing huge artworks by Anish Kapoor and the Tanks, and just really ambitious stuff that the early 2000s gave in the UK in the Tate model or whatever.
So growing up in London, it's a blessing, right?
It was a blessing and stuff. So I'm super thankful you see so many cultures, so many artworks down there. So yeah.
And how about your education?
My education was, I went to school in South London. I studied at Goldsmiths.
How was that?
It was, I don't know, I would say it was tricky in the way that any fine art university is. I think Goldsmiths as well, at the time there wasn't, I would say, that much queer art happening. There was only, I think, one queer tutor, so there was quite a bit of a lack of conversation around that subject matter. This was 2012 or 2015, so it was before there was this queer consciousness amongst institutions, amongst the art scene that we see now. So for me, it was a bit of a isolating experience, but I think it allowed me to get really into my work and to.
Did you find a community, an artistic community?
I think I didn't really know. I was more in the clubs basically. So I was out in Soho, also discovering myself, my sexuality, who I was as an individual as well as a teenager does in a big city. So I was mostly just doing that. But then it was after Goldsmiths that I guess, met with my community or other artists, like myself a little bit.
And also you in Paris for a year at the Cité des Arts residency. And how is being in Paris for you? How does it feel?
I mean, Paris is, so when I was younger we would always come back to France quite a lot. Even my mum was a little bit crazy in the way that she would drive from London to Calais just to do her shopping for a month.
With French products?
She would go to a farmer's market in Calais because it was cheaper than in the UK. So I feel like quite at home in France. A lot of my family's here. For me it feels as home as London does really in a way.
And so the residency is in Montmartre, which is a stunning sort of garden where you have been at peace working on this show that we are in now. How did this exhibition come together for you? You've worked, I think, tremendously hard and you've produced a lot of new paintings, and one of which we are sitting in front of, this like large fresco almost. And you've also produced a series of sculptures and a sound piece. Do you want to talk a bit about this exhibition and how it came together?
Yeah, sure. Practice? I mean, I feel like we're in the painting right now.
It's literally in the painting.
But I basically started 8 months ago in London, and then I finished it as well on the residency in Montmartre. But I guess I started working on this show because already I've always been interested in, I guess, the general public's perception of like political geography, gender identity, how the general public think about these big topics, and how there's a bit of a friction there always, how there's things that people don't always want to see or talk about, and for me those are points of interest. So I started looking back at culturally what's been happening in the news around Palestine, around the different activism circles that have been happening, the different intersectional moments that have been happening, and how to express what's happening, and looking at how language is changing and forming, and people's notion and imagination of the Middle East is also like changing a lot, and trying to use different ways that feel familiar to me to express those themes. So I started like researching a lot the idea of a border just by itself. How do you construct a border? What are the design?
Yeah, exactly. So it seems like this notion of border is borders, actually plural, is at the core of what you practice, in particular this exhibition. And I would say perhaps the ambiguity of borders inherited from colonial history. Here we see like this environment of fragmented landscapes, border like division of walls and gates, perhaps those that have actually enclosed Palestine since or Palestinian territories since the early 2000s. And I'm also thinking about the titles of most of your works that seem to come straight from this like border identity check, passport please, enforcement shoe, a suspicious item.
So I think when working with an imagery of a border, like it's again going back to how what does it look like essentially? How do you design it? What are the design decisions and stuff like that? I started trying to imagine what I wanted to see, what I wanted to take from these images and my research, and essentially create a bit of a third space in my work, a type of experimental semi-fictional space to to show these spaces that are essentially everywhere and nowhere. So I was using a lot of I guess the tools that you have as a citizen looking at borders on the other side of the world. So I was looking at like forensic architectures, research, and how they describe borders being a little bit everywhere and nowhere, how their environment can sometimes be violent due to where they are in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of a desert.
So how did you get acquainted actually with this group of forensic architecture, which is a research group based in the UK, but like sort of originating from the UK, but a little bit everywhere?
Well, I think it's because I was sort of super interested in Palestinian borders, the architecture, and they're one of the few groups who have done extensive research on these sites, and their research is very transparent, it's very available for anyone to see. It's very progressive, transgressive in ways that other research isn't, and that's what I guess like drew me to it. I had also been to these borders myself during my time in Palestine, looked at these photos through Al Jazeera, and when using or referencing them in my paintings, I wanted to know more, but there was obviously limitations, so that's how I came across their research. I'd always known about their work, but I thought maybe for this show I would actually consult with the findings and the researchers to help me create my semi-imagined worlds in a way.
So sort of to go back to this question around the notion of borders, I wanted to ask you how, or if even those borders appear somehow formally on the surfaces of your canvas.
Yeah, I mean, I think they do. Sometimes they're directly represented, so they're very recognizable objects, but sometimes I've also deconstructed it to really just take the bare foundations of what makes a border, so looking at like concrete and metal and stainless steel, and use that to create a slightly imagined landscape which can sometimes resemble a portal or represent an environment or just add to the sensation of a border but not directly be represented. I think they're also represented through the bodies in the work, through silhouetting, through sometimes the outfits, which can be compressing or can be like stretched or
perhaps are there any works that you would like to talk about in particular, or maybe is this one, or maybe we talk more about this one when we talk about at the end about clubbing, no? And that makes more sense. So perhaps another like important theme within the work is the representation, or at least the understanding of the queer body. That can also be seen in a way as both intimate and as both an intimate and a public border. Also, once bodies are liberated, borders will be as well. And in the text that I wrote for this exhibition, I quoted writer and scholar Paul Preciado when he writes that the body is a true living political archive, and that its stigmas reflects the event and traumas of the time we live in. Does this speak to you, or does this?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think for me, the bodies in the work, I'm interested in like radical forms of representation, of subversion, of I guess pushing the boundaries of how you represent a body by trying to be a bit transgressive as well in the way I represent it. And the way I looked to represent the bodies was to look back in art history at artists and painters during World War II, World War I, painters such as Francis Bacon, René Magritte, William Blake as well, who were working during a post-war era or during a war era, and they were essentially going through, I guess, a little bit what we're going through in today's world of a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unease as well, and or even just this kind of world we live in of dehumanization, of seeing bodies on a daily within different media circles, and we then lose our connection to these bodies. And the way they dealt with that was through radical representation, through subversion. Like if you think of Francis Bacon's paintings, they look like they're exploding and stuff like that. William Blake's work was interested in reaching a higher force and stuff. And I think I used those ways of representing bodies to work on the bodies in my show in a way. It also reminds me one artist which we might speak about later as well, is Pierre Molinier, who was I think radically using the uncertainty of the war to fragment his body as a type of soothing and self understanding as well, and that way of essentially creating your own armor, your own anatomy, I think spoke to me and what I was trying to do in my works as well.
Yeah, and Pierre Molinier is an important figure of French photography and this sort of avant-garde within the avant-garde, because he was a dissent voice of the surrealists. So that's kind of interesting how he broke the rules within a movement that was already aiming at breaking rules, and that's kind of interesting. This sort of mise en abîme of breaking rules and being provocation, and perhaps that also leads us to the notion of fetishism and the fetish body, which also appears throughout your work, and how exactly how you were saying, you explore this fragmentation of the human body in a way to reframe a new vision of it.
Yeah, I think it's using basically gender expression, using that outside of itself to communicate something else, like whether that's the Palestinian movement or fragmentation associated with Palestine or issues of war stuff. But for me, like, I also liked how Pierre Molinier is still a controversial figure today. Some people hate him, some people still like.
Some love him.
Yeah, some love him too. But to kind of have that still going in an art practice beyond history and stuff, I found was quite strong. And I was thinking, well, what does it mean if I reproduce this image in the context of my wider work around examining geographical, political borders and bodily borders? Like, what sensations does it create in a viewer who is trying to understand the series? So for me, I felt like his work is the most direct points to referencing art history. Usually in my work, I don't normally directly copy someone else's artwork literally like that, but his works worked really well at activating a little bit all the other figures, and also playing into, I guess, when you're queer, sometimes you want to paint your own narrative, you want to reject normal ways of thinking, you want to imagine your own life and do your own thing. I think that is the message, again, throughout the show, of trying to use imagery, which sometimes doesn't always go together, to produce new ways of thinking. And I ultimately think that that's how knowledge is made. That's how people experience also politics nowadays. There's often a lot of cross-pollination between topics, between imagery, and that's how ideas are born. So for me,
that's intersectionality, actually.
Yeah, I guess it is. And I felt like in this 24-piece series, I wanted to be intersectional with the visual referencing throughout the show, to look at artists who had gone beyond, or who had resisted, or who were fighting something or dealing with something that was beyond them at the time, in a way that sometimes when you're Palestinian you feel a little bit like that as well, that there's a lot of complex emotions there around who you are, and I think many Palestinian people feel that, even if they've never lived there or been there or just live in Europe. It's that kind of void sometimes that you feel, and for me, Pierre Molyneux's work spoke to that referenced throughout the
Yeah.
show, basically, for me.
And actually, I think the tool also, another tool you're using for this idea of resistance is colors. Right, on the one hand, you use like the, green and white and black and from the Palestinian and red from the Palestinian flag. On the other hand, there's like this explosion of psychedelic colors.
Yes.
So how do you negotiate your palette? How do you form it for canvas?
I think when I approached this series, I basically started. I approached it from a color perspective a little bit, breaking down the colors of nationalistic colors sometimes in the French and British flag and the Palestinian flags, very vibrant colors. But I was also interested in the color palette of light and of sometimes subculture, of activism circles, of the club, of nightlife, as a type of liquid substance in a way. So the colors, the paintings are in groups of greens and purples, and then there's a rainbow series, and that was all essentially referencing a type of a nightlife environment to try and comment on what are the binding forces in our society. Sometimes where people come together who maybe wouldn't necessarily talk to each other in the street or whatever, or what a space is within the city where ideas are formed again, or when knowledge is made. And for me, those immersive environments, which is not like the club, spoke to me in my paintings, to be the glue for the other stuff in a way. So yeah.
And interestingly, also you mentioned earlier you as a kid in the 2000s in London, going to clubs a lot, and it seems like references to nightlife and pop culture are very key to this exhibition, and including this painting we're sitting in front of. I would say this idea of the dance floor as a meeting place or a space of resistance that can break down borders between people, communities, genders.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've summed it up really well, that it can sometimes be a place of breaking down binaries, categories, borders, systems. It's a space, like I said before, where knowledge production is produced, and it's, I don't know, I think you can learn a lot about things basically through nightlife.
Do you want to say a few words about this painting, since we're sitting in front of it, and it's like sort of, I mean, I hate this word, it's not a masterpiece, but it's like a coda, a moment in the exhibition. Is the final work the visitors discover. It's the largest one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it follows through the theme of nightlife, of it being a bit of a resistance sometimes, and I do see my work quite playful and hopeful and sometimes semi-fictional, and in this work I kind of wanted a bit of a anti-war mural a little bit at the back of the show, so I was interested as well in the idea of people who had lost rights and then gained rights before, so I looked into the New York in the 1970s, in the Pier District, and this was at a time when LGBTQIA+ people didn't really have any rights, so they would congregate at these piers which were falling apart, crumbling, but then you have all these archival photos of people really living out their best lives, living their true gendered identities, living their lives that they couldn't live in New York at the time. And for me, those photos spoke to me because they reminded me of like the Palestinian kind of resistance movements of people fighting for rights, and also just generally the LGBTQI+ struggle as well.
Yeah, how did you come across this archive? Can you talk more about
this
encounter, and also how you used these images as an inspiration for the work?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I feel like with archives, I don't really use them properly. I just go on Google Arts and Culture and see what I can via the internet. And a lot of archives and centres will often upload all their stuff on Google Arts and Culture, so you can just sit in your bedroom and see all these photos day in, day out. And sometimes I do use them for wide referencing systems, but also I think it's interesting to see, I think to understand resistance you have to learn the history of it and see images of what people looked like before they gained rights and how they are now. I find that quite a hopeful thing to do. So I normally have a lot of archives on my iPad, and then I bring all these photos out, and then the figures make it into the compositions, like in this one basically. So these are all referenced figures from that peer district, which I've placed in a bit of a location-free, geography-free environment in a way.
There's so much depth and movement in this painting.
It's also accompanied by a sound piece, which is off right now, but the sound piece activates it a little bit as well and adds to that.
Did you compose it?
No, I worked with a composer called Owen Pratt, who's worked with me before, and for him I showed him the paintings, the photos I was working with, and we spoke a lot about the idea of resistance, of borders, of political borders, of the aesthetics and architectural decisions, and I also told him about the clubbing references that I wanted, and he really imagined this 14-minute long soundtrack which really referenced the concrete and the metal and the long corridors and the clubbing culture as well, into a type of, I like to describe it as a bit of a semi-broken radio station which comes in and comes out. It's designed to be very subtle, sometimes you don't always hear it. It has my vocals in it as well, which plays into this wider idea of fragmentation throughout the show.
So what did sound add on to the installation, you think?
I think for me, when I paint, I'm really inspired by sound in general. I'm really inspired by movement, I think as well sound and science fiction go well together for me. So for me, it was a way of viewing this mural behind us without, I guess, the bleakness that a contemporary art gallery can sometimes have when you just do a painting show. It was a way to just fill up the air in a way, and add a bit of an oomph to the show as well.
And you also produced an installation of boxes, 12 boxes? No?
I think it's 12, yeah.
12, right? So 12 boxes made of Palestinian Majdoul dates, boxes actually, and they are sort of adorned with elements related to the notion of borders again, standing as vernacular remnants of how Palestinian culture has managed to cross borders into Western Europe. Can you say a few more words about these boxes, what they represent, how they came to life?
I mean, for me, it was like I was saying at the beginning of the talk, I'm always interested in how these big topics hit the general public, and these boxes of dates, which are widely available across Europe in shops, are one of the few
across the world,
one of the few interactions that people have with just Palestinian culture in general. It's an actual product that has come from that place, and that speaks to me. But for me, it reinforces ideas of land, of Palestine as a country, and
a cultural
entity. As a place, I think as well in culture, there's a lot of censorship that is happening now. There's a lot of misinformation as well about Palestine, and the way these dates also represent actually having physically gone through a border, of leaving the Palestinian border and then entering entering the Western European market. So in a way, they're a factual part of the show, and I saw them as well as quite playful, quite absurd in a way, which also played into maybe some of the more surrealist references in the show as well. I liked how, for me, when I basically these were also dates that I just eat on a daily basis, but when last year when the war intensified, I noticed the supply chains were breaking. So I started collecting these boxes because a lot of the shops were no longer stocking them. And I was just imagining the visual transition into the Western world, really. Like imagining if this box could talk back, what would it say? So if they have sometimes materials associated with the environment of a border again, so there's sometimes nails that are coming out of it, different foreign currencies glued on other ones. There's some slightly more like brooches from I guess you would associate with a Western consumerist type of materiality there, and they're just generally quite experimental objects which I guess link to the ideas of the paintings. I think as well they're like a literal reference to that geographical part of the world in the show as well, and they're also absurd. Like that for me,
they have humor.
They have humor, and I find that plays into the idea of sometimes how absurd borders can be, and how absurd immigration can be. That like these boxes of dates can be exported, but maybe the people can't or cannot travel as much. So that was like another level to them a little bit, and also to present them as a sculpture in a gallery, I found quite interesting, because I was like, what does it do to this object? That's something. I feel like that's something I'm still figuring out. It was a bit of an experiment to do that, but I really love them. For me, they play into the more playful part of my art practice, because I do see my work as quite playful in the imagery and the colours and the ways I work with paint as well. So I think that has to be reflected as well somewhat for me as well, because I'm naturally as well quite a playful, experimental person as well in my approach to art making. So
So speaking of experimentations and further sort of imaginations, what are you going to work next on?
Well, next time I'm still at City des Arts for another, I think, 9 months now. So I'm working on a film there.
What's the film?
The film is still in development, but following similar themes. I'm also working on a series of murals, a bit like this one. So I'm basically working on that. I find it quite hard to talk about work which is in development a little bit, because I guess that's why I'm on this art residency, to figure it out.
You have time, you have space.
I have time and space a little bit.
It's a luxury.
So I'm enjoying it basically. So
film. Have you ever worked with film in the past?
Yeah, I do quite a lot of film actually. I see the film side of my art practice as also very experimental. It's more leans to like fine art cinema, not really feature film director things. I have made a few films. I guess film is it's more expensive to make. It takes a bit more time. Whereas for me, like painting is also linked a lot to my, I guess, to my self-confidence, my self-esteem in a way. It's something that I use as a daily practice to just sustain like myself. It's also a medium that I can do more cheaply and faster. And I'm someone who also thinks when I work. So often the films and the paintings mirror each other, and in the past I have shown them together as well.
Well, Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Gaby.
you.
Thank you for this beautiful exhibition.
Also, thank you for writing the text.
Yes, it was
so
a pleasure.
Cool.
And I'm excited to see you film sometime soon,
Yeah.
and more murals and beautiful works.
Cool, thank you. I mean, me too.